Hello guys, and welcome again in our 8th video in our series of building a water tracker app. So let's see what we have built so far. So I did run the app on an emulator, and so far we have this app, and when you open the app you can see that you cannot see the remaining because you still didn't set a goal. Now if we click on those buttons we can see the number increasing, but we should go and try to set a goal. Let's say we're gonna set 5,000 milliliters as our daily goal. When we come back to home, now we can see the progress bar. We can, every time we drink water, we record that entry. We can also add a custom amount. Let's say we can also go to the history to see the amounts and the time and scroll to see all of them. And we can also delete history, delete entries from the history, and then it will update. Now, the problem at this point is that if I close the app and then you open the app again, you will simply see that you lost all the intakes inside. This is because when you close the app, the state or the variables inside the app, they all go and get destroyed and they get reset. So when you open again, it starts from 0. So to be able to maintain or save the intakes that you give for this app, we need to use something called shared preferences. So what is shared preferences? Shared preferences is simply a way to store key value pairs in the local storage of the device, whether this was a phone, a smartphone, like an Android or iOS, or web, or even desktop. So an example on such thing, for example, here we can see that we have a group of keys, like the username or a flag that is user logged in, and we store their values. A simple example of this, that when you go into an app that you already logged in before, the token is already stored in the shared preferences of that app. So when you go, let's say, to Facebook or Instagram, you don't need to log in every time. This is one of the most common usage of shared preferences. So to understand shared preferences, you have to understand two things. One, what are the data types that I can store or get from shared preferences? And the second thing are the actions that you can take to deal with the shared preferences. So for the data types first, you actually are able to store and retrieve string, integer, double, boolean, and list of strings. And for actions in Nowa, like what you can do with the shared preferences, you can set a value, you can get a value, you can remove a value by, including its key, and you can clear the entire shared preferences. Now we're gonna see those actions right now when we implement that for our app. So in our case, we have actually 3 state variables. We have the total water intake that the user drink at that every specific day that we need to store. And the second one is today's logs, and it's a list of water log entry. And in this list, we store individual entries that the user does to be able to see the specific time of every entry, the amount of every entry, and to be able to delete those entries. That's why we use the list next to using the integer, which is the total water intake. Now, the third thing is the daily goal, when we have to be able to store and retrieve the daily goal. Now, to be able to maintain those state, we have to think about two things: the saving and the loading. So we need to save those values when they change to the shared preference, and we need to be able to load them when we open the app. Now, to be able to save those values, we don't actually need to add any new function. We only need to modify those 3 existing functions. We have already a function called add water log that we use to add a single entry, and we can make this function also save the new list in the shared preferences. Now we do the same thing for delete entry. When we delete an entry from the list, we also save the new list in the shared preferences. And the last function that we already set in the last videos, which is set a daily goal. So this function, we call it when the user set a daily goal from the dialog, and we can modify this function to add a statement to save the new daily goal in the shared preferences. Now for loading, we need to actually create 2 new functions. The first one is load data, and we will use this function to load all those state variables when we open the app. The second function is calculate water intake. Now, Why do we need this function? Just because we don't actually have to store the variable total water intake, because in the end we can calculate it by using the list. We already have the list that has all the intakes. So what we can do is just sum up all the amounts in the list, and then we have the total water intake. Now, of course, doing such a thing, it's good to reduce the possibility of getting bugs or errors, that you try to rely on the least amount of variables possible. Okay, so now let's go back to our water state, which is the global state we created in this series. And as we explained already, we'll start modifying the function. So let's now focus on the daily goal. So let's try to set and get the daily goal. So we already have the function that set a new daily goal. So we're gonna open it, and as we can see, it already set a new daily goal, but for the variable inside the global state. So we're getting a parameter, we create a parameter called daily goal param that receive the new daily goal as a parameter of this function, and then it uses that param to set the daily goal variable that exists in the global state. And then we notify listeners to update the UI if there's any UI that actually listens to this daily goal, which is actually the home screen. Now, after this, we're gonna add another node. And this node, we're gonna go under the category shared preferences, and we will choose set. And here we're able to set a new key and add the value for that key to the shared preferences. So first of all, the type that we will go to is an integer. This is the daily goal. And the key, I will call it daily goal. I will try to also maintain the same name as the variable name here. And this is because just to minimize the possibility of getting any error. And the value that I will store in this daily goal will be the one I am getting in the parameter, which is daily goal param. I'm gonna go to value, open the locals, and then choose daily goal param. And then here we see options like await if you want to do other statements after this node. So you don't want to skip to the next one unless this one is complete. But for us, we don't need that. Okay, so now let's talk about loading. So as we saw already, we would have to create a new function to load the data. So we're gonna create a new function, and then it's here, and then we're gonna call it load data. And the return type is void because we don't want to return anything from this function. So the first thing we're gonna do in this load data function is try to get the daily goal from the shared preferences. To do that, click on, go under the category shared preferences and choose the node get, which is used to get a value from the shared preferences. Now the type that we want to get is an integer, and the key is daily goal. Now here I will try to get the daily goal. Now the thing is, if there was no daily goal stored, this will return null. Okay, so because I have the default value of the daily goal to be 0, I can't set the daily goal to be null because the type is nullable, but because the default value is 0 and I want it to stay 0 if the user did not set a goal. This is how we build the expressions in the video before, so I don't want to go back and modify that. So now what I'm going to do here in this function is that I will store, I can already pick an existing variable, which is a daily goal, and make the value that I will get from the shared preferences goes automatically to the daily goal. But this means that if the user did not set the daily goal, let's say when they open the app for the first time, then the daily goal will be null. And I want it to be either 0 when the user did not set anything, or the actual value. This is just because of what I did in the last video, and I don't want to go back. But in the end, I can just simply go back to the expressions and handle when the daily goal is null. But because I want to keep the default value as it is, I will pick here a new variable. So I will store the value that I will get in a new variable, and I will call it, let's say, temporary daily goal. Now, what I will do next is I will use an if statement to check if this temporary daily goal is null or not. So in the condition here, I can just go to custom expression and I can write if the temporary daily goal doesn't equal to null. Evaluate. So this means that now we will check if this variable is not null. If it's not null, which means that there is a daily goal, then I will set that value for the daily goal that I have in the global state. So I will pick the daily goal from the which exists here. By the way, again, since we are now in the global state and the daily goal is in the same global state, we can find it under locals, because you don't have to go to globals first, choose the water state and then pick the daily goal, you are already inside the global state. So just be aware, you have always to think about the location of the variable by reference of like where you are and how this variable is referenced to you. Now, since we have the daily goal here, we want to set a new value for it, and the new value will be then the temporary daily goal that we got from the shared preferences. Now, if it's null, which means that this condition is false, which means that the temporary daily goal that we got from the shared preferences is null, which means that there is no saved value for the daily goal, I will not do anything, which means that the daily goal that has 0 as a default value will stay 0. Okay, so this is for the daily goal. We actually are done implementing saving and loading for the daily goal. As you remember, we already said that we need to modify the add water log and delete entry to be able to update the list. And because I don't want to repeat the logic in two different functions, I can create a separate function and then call that same function inside the add water log and inside delete entry. So let's do that. So now we will create a new function, and this function will be called save today's logs. And this function will just save the list of today's logs to the shared preferences. So let's open the function, and then we're going to go to shared preferences and we will choose get. Now here, if you remember, we said that the types that you can save are string, list, double, boolean, and a string list, which is like a list of strings. But the problem is that the list we have is a list of water log entry, which is a custom type. So what are we going to do in this case? So the list looks like this. For example, we have, let's say, a list that has 2 objects, and each one has the amount and it has the date. And this is, as it is like that, we cannot store it in shared preferences. We need to do something called encoding. To do that, we have to learn new 2 concepts, which are the JSON encode, which will convert an object to a JSON string, which means that we can give the object, which is a list of that custom type, to this JSON encode function, and this will convert the entire thing to a single string that we can then store in the shared preferences. Now, when we want to load, we can load that string, and then using JSON decode, we can decode that string back into an object, which is the list. So let's say we have this list, which we talked about before, and it has 2 items. Now, after we encode this list, it will look like this. It will look like a single string that has a list inside, and inside the list there's 2 objects, each object which is a JSON object, which is a key value pair, like it has the amount and the date, and we will store this inside the shared preferences. And then when we decode it back, it will look back again as the list. Okay, now, so to deal with the encoding and decoding, we actually need to use custom code in this case. So let's open the state, the water state in VS Code. And we will paste actually 2 functions just completely outside the class itself. We will go outside the class to add them as global functions, and we will paste those 2 functions. We will explain now what they do, but they simply encode and decode the list. Now, we need to import the Dart convert, which is this package that has the JSON encode and JSON decode functions. Now, let's see them one by one. So inside any custom type you do, if you remember, we already created water log entry before. There is a function that automatically gets generated for you, which is from JSON and to JSON. Those 2 functions are made that if you have a JSON value present that object, you can call from JSON and pass the JSON, and then it will create the object water log entry for you. Now, the same thing in opposite for to JSON, that if you have an object already and you want to convert it to JSON, this object will get the variables that exist, or the state, like the amount and the date in this case, and convert them into, now here we convert them into a map. And then this map, when we call the JSON encode here or here, it will convert it into a single string or a single JSON string. So simply what we're doing when we want to encode the list is that we go, now we're already using a list of water log entry. So what we do here inside, we map every item from the list and we convert that item into the JSON format. So then we will have, instead of having a list of objects, we will have a list of map, which is a key value pair in the end, and every map will present a single object. And then we will convert it to a list, and then we will just encode the whole list for a single JSON string. To explain more what I'm talking about, if let's say we have this single object that is a water log entry that has an amount and date time, after we call to JSON inside that object, it will be converted like this, which is a map that has key value pair. The first key is the amount, the last key is the date, and it has the amount and the date. So we convert every item inside the list here into its map presentation here. And then when we have the list of maps, we then call the encode function to convert that list into a single JSON string. So let's talk now about decode. So decode, we will receive the encoded list as a string, and then we will convert it with the function JSON decode to a list. And this list will be a list of maps. And inside each map will be a key value for a single water log entry. And then we will use the function map that will convert every item inside the list to another item. And then each item, which is here going to be the element, we then calling the function from JSON inside the water log entry, and we pass that map to the function from JSON, which will then receive that map, which is, the JSON presentation of that object, and then convert it back into an object of water log entry, and then convert the result again to list. Just if you don't get it completely, just try to Google it online. It's pretty easy to understand. But in general, we just need to have those two custom functions that will help us to encode and decode the list of water log entry. Now let's go back to Nowa. And then here we can go back again to the function that we created, which is save today's logs. Okay, so this function is made to save the today's logs. But before we save it, we need to encode it into a JSON string. So what we need to do is we need to call the global function that we created. Now we can find it here under water tracker final, which is the name of the app, or we can simply just search for a function which is encode list. We can see that it's a function and it returns a string in the end. So we will call this function. Now, as we already saw, if you remember, we already saw that this encode list, it receives a parameter, which is a list of water log entry. So this is what it needs. So now here, if we hover, you will see that it needs a list of water log entry. Now the list that we will save is the list here, which is the today's logs that we created in the last videos. So I'm gonna just pick the today's logs. And then I will store this in a new variable. I will call it encoded list. So this will present the list after it being encoded, and it's a string. Then I will save this string in the shared preferences. So I'm going to go again to the shared preferences and set a new string. Actually, I will keep it string, and the key will be encode, or I'm going to call it today's logs. And then the value will be the encoded list I just created above. So this will be the encoded list, which I'm going to then save. That's it. So here we're just encoding the list into a JSON string, and then we are saving this JSON string in the shared preferences. Now let's go to the load data. Now here in the load data, we will also try to go to the shared preferences and try to get the key, which is today's logs. Then we will store this in a new variable, and we will call it today's logs stored, or we're going to call it stored today's logs. Now this function will present the JSON string that we just got from the shared preferences. Now again, remember that this might be null if there was no stored today's logs. So to be able to deal with that, again, we're going to create an if statement, and inside the if statement we're going to check if it's null or not. So we're going to go to a custom expression and write if the stored today's logs doesn't equal null or equal null. But for me, I like to say it doesn't equal null because I want the true side to be what should happen most of the time. So if the stored today's logs is not null, then I need to decode the stored today's log back into a list and then save it in the water state. So we will call the other function now, that is decode list, and decode list returns a list in the end, or a list of water log entry. So we're going to call this, and then here we need to pass the encoded list, which is a string. So this is exactly the function here we created. So we are here, we need to pass a string of which is the encoded list, which is the one we got from the shared preferences at this point. And then we will get the normal list that we already have. So then we can click on encoded list and pick the stored today's logs, which is now we are sure that it's not null. And then we can, instead of storing the value in a new variable, we can actually pick a variable. And this variable is the list that we already have, which is the today's logs. So this will just set the today's logs to be equal to the ones we already saved in the shared preferences, but after we already decoded the JSON string back into our normal list. Now, if it's false, will I do anything? No. So it's already an empty list. Now, again, the problem that if I directly set the today's logs without checking it that if it's null or not, that here the list, we have an empty list, and an empty list is not same as null. Null means it's not still defined. And since because we already built the expressions depending on if the list is empty or not empty, I'm going to keep it like that. Just because I don't want to handle the situations where there is also a possibility that this variable will be even null. Now it's a list and it will always be a list. So I'm going to keep it as an empty list or a list that has some waterlog entry object. Otherwise, I will have to handle the null situation on all the places I already used the today's logs. Now here, another thing we need to do is, okay, now we got back our list, but the total water intake, we still need to calculate it. So we need to create a new function that calculate the total water intake and update the variable here, which is the today water intake. So let's do that. So we can create a function called calculate total intake. And this will not return anything, so we can open the function. Okay, so now in this function, we need to use actually the today's logs list. And here we will use the amount inside every object of the water log entry inside this list to calculate the total intake. We can access the list in two ways. We can directly access the list from here, if we go under locals, we can directly get the list. But the problem here is that you need to remember to use the function after you set the shared preferences. Otherwise, you will be calling calculate total intake on an empty list because the default value is empty before we set the new value from the shared preferences. But the other way is that you can simply create a parameter and this will reduce your chances to get an error. So if I create a parameter and I call it a list, and the type will be a list of water log entry, and then when I use a function, I pass the list to this function, I have less chance to make this mistake because when every time I want to use this function, I pass already the list for it, then I have more chance to be aware that am I sending an empty list or I'm sending a filled list. But both will result the same. So now I'm just going to keep the parameter here, which is the list. So now what I'm going to do is I will create a new local variable. So this local variable is only created inside this function. So when it's done, this variable actually gets deleted. And this variable will be integer and this will hold the total sum. So I'm going to call it total sum. And I don't want it, of course, to be final because I will keep changing it. And it will start with 0. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get every item inside the list, get the amount from that item, and add it to the total until I iterate over every single item in the list. Now, to do that, we have to use a function called ForEach inside the list. So first, I need to access a function inside the list, which is the parameter I created, which is this one. So I'm going to go to the locals and then find the list, which is a parameter I created. And then under expression, I can then go and choose ForEach. And ForEach now is a function that will execute on every item inside the list. Now, if we look here, we can see a function next to action. And this is the action that will be applied on every item in the list. So if we click on it, it opens another logic, another circuit. And here you can see already there's a parameter called element, which is the item in the list that I am now at. So what I'm going to do is this element, if you remember, the list is a list of water log entry. So this element is a single element from the list, which means that the element is from the type water log entry. And as you remember, in the water log entry, we have amount and we have the date. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the amount and add it to the total sum that we created. Now, since this function I'm creating here comes under this function for each, then the scope of this function here have access to the variables created here, which means that if I create here total sum in the upper function, when I go to the function inside the ForEach, I can access that total sum. It's exactly like code. The inner functions, the scope they have includes the variables that are in the upper functions. Now, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, when we look at the code, you will get what I mean. But in general, since I'm creating this function inside ForEach, and in the upper context, there is the total sum, meaning that I can access that variable from inside here. So I will actually access that. So I'm going to call total sum, and I will set a new value for the total sum. And the new value for the total sum will be the older value plus the amount inside the element. So to do that, I'm going to actually go to custom expression, and I will say that the total sum equals total sum again plus amount or element dot amount. Evaluate, close. So what we are doing simply is that the element here is a single element from the list. So we're accessing the amount variable inside the element, and we are adding that value to the older value of the total sum. So in the first time, total sum is 0, and then it will go to the first item in the list. Let's say the amount was 100, then it will add 100 here to 0, so the total sum will be 100. Now, when it goes to the second item in the list, and the second item, let's say, has 200 as an amount, then here in this expression, it will add the 200 to the older total sum, which is 100. So then the total will be 300. And then this will go for the next and the next. And when it's done, going through all the items, the total sum will present the total amount that the user drank at that day. So that's what we need to do. We are setting the total sum. That's it. So now we can close the function. And then here, when we're done, we will have the total sum to actually be to the total water intake here. So here, when we're done, we will set the total water or today water intake. We will set a new value for it, and this new value will be the total sum. All right. So let's now close this. Now, if you want to see what's happening, we can go back to, see the function. So this is a function. We created an integer called total sum, that is 0. Then we are calling ForEach on every item in the list, which is we're already passing from the as a parameter in the function. And then we are adding the element dot amount, which is the amount on every element in the list, to the older total sum. And then we are setting the today water intake, which is the variable here, to be equal to the total sum. Now, what I need to do is to go back again to the function that loads the data. And then after I already set the today's logs, then I can simply calculate today total intake. And then here it will request me to submit the list, and this will be the today's logs. So here I'm going to pass the today's logs. Or you can simply not create a parameter and simply just make it directly access the today's logs. But here, at least when I pass the today's logs, when I do that, I'd be like, okay, I already set the value for this list before I'm calling the calculate total intake. So I am doing it in the right order. All right. So now we did set the today's logs. We did calculate the total intake. All right, that's it. So we have the function ready now. So now we created the load data function, but then we need to call it. So what we want is to call that function from the home screen. So before anything loads in the home screen, we want to call load data. So to do that, we have to override the function initState. So initState is a function that gets called before the screen loads. And inside this function here, what we can do, I mean, this initial state is something called inside Flutter that sets everything up. So we don't need to do anything here. But then after we do that, we can simply go to the global state, which is the water state, and then call the function load data. So what this will do is that when the user opens the home screen, then the first thing is going to happen is that it will try to initialize everything, and then it will load the data. And then after it loads the data, it will then render the UI. So when we render the UI and we are using like the daily goal, or we're showing the total water intake, then the data is already loaded. So it will display correctly. All right, so now after we set everything, let's run this app and test it. So we already have the IO simulator, then we're just gonna click on play. All right, now we can see that the app is running. So now let's try to, okay, we're adding an amount, but we don't have a goal. So let's just set a goal. Let's make it, let's say 6,000. Let's go back again to the home. Now we can add more amounts. We can see now it's moving, and we can see the goal and the remaining. Now let's try to close the app and open again. So if we open the app again, all right, now we can see that the daily goal was saved. So now we are getting it, but we lost the total or the water intakes. Also, if we open the history, we lost, or we cannot see everything. And this is because we forgot something, which is to actually call the function we created in the, so remember, we created a function that save the today's logs, but we forgot to call it because we have to call it inside the add water log and remove. So we already have the function that we use to add water logs. So in the end, we're gonna call the function which is save today's logs that we created today. And we will do the same thing when we remove an entry from the list, which is delete entry. So here we delete an entry from the list, and then we will have to call again save today's logs. That will save the updated list. So in the first function, we save the updated list after adding an item, and here we're saving the list after deleting an item. And then when you save, let's say if you save multiple times, it's okay, because if you save a value to the shared preferences with the same key, it will just override the older value. So now let's try again to run the app and see the result. All right, now we can see the app is running. So let's again quickly set a daily goal as before, come back to the home screen, add more values. So now we are at 2,700. Now let's try to close the app and now open it again. And we can see now we already have the latest values. So that the goal was loaded correctly and the total water intake is loaded correctly. And also we can see that the list is also loaded. So now let's say we delete items from the list to actually just test the delete entry function. So now we have 800 left. So now we can again close the app and then open it again. And then we can see that this is the latest value. Amazing. So here now we can see that we were able to use shared preferences to save and load the values of the today's logs and the daily goal. Now in the next video, what we're gonna do, we will actually go and make the history screen work. So here we will be able to see a history for the last 7 days, and to see like which days we hit our goal and which day we did not, and how close were we in each of the last 7 days of hitting our goal. Thank you for watching, guys, and see you again in an upcoming video.